Carolyn Holmes is joining us from Mississippi, where she's an assistant professor of political science and public administration at Mississippi State University. Her book, The Black and White Rainbow, was published by University of Michigan Press in 2020.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you for the generous introduction. Yes, I'm talking about positionality, research ethics, and the idea of what I'm calling contact-based research. So I want to start off with two central, potentially controversial opening salvos, right? First is that research that involves research in general involves ethical decisions that are vastly outside of the scope of the institutional mechanisms that we have that we think of as governing ethics. And we'll talk about why and how that process happens. And then second, that research ethics, regardless of method, regardless of approach, but especially in what I'm calling contact-based research, are conditioned by positionality, both of a researcher and their interlocutors. So I'm not necessarily saying that the institutional mechanisms that we have for reviewing ethics are irrelevant or unimportant, but just that we have an ethical landscape in which we participate that is outside of the scope of those review boards. So just to establish my bona fides vis-a-vis the my support for the IRB and the REB, right? We can think about the history of where these ethical research standards come from, things like the Nuremberg Code and the idea of informed consent, because the history of human subjects-based research is replete with all sorts of horrible examples about what happens when investigators fail to respect humans and their human rights as ends in themselves. So after the Nuremberg trials in August 1947, we have the introduction of the Nuremberg Code and the idea of informed consent, which means that no one can be forced to participate in human experiments and all participants should be informed of the potential risks. Yet this was insufficient as an intervention to promote ethical research involving human subjects. And so we have in the United States, the National Research Act of 1974, after things like the Tuskegee experiments and the Willowbrook study, which subjected human subjects to infectious diseases. And this then was followed on by the Belmont Report, which establishes the basic principles that we think of as associated with the IRB, specifically respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So respect for persons, the idea that people are autonomous and have the right to be protected, especially among vulnerable populations. I know that for the REB in Canada, this includes an additional layer of scrutiny for research among First Nations peoples as a result of the sort of horrors perpetrated on them in the name of both scientific and social scientific research. But this also applies to things like women and people that are pregnant, people that are incarcerated, et cetera. The idea of beneficence, right, the promotion of well-being and the duty that requires a maximization of that harm to benefit ratio for individual participants, and then justice, focusing on the duty to assign the burden and benefits of research fairly. And this is what's codified in what is in the United States, the IRB, and in Canada in the REB, although I know that the standards are slightly different. They have the same sort of legal and social origins. So the important thing to note in this history, right, is that these fundamental principles, beneficence, justice, and respect for persons, are based on largely medical rather than an interpersonal model of research. And so we have started to think in political science and sort of social science more generally about how and why these principles are important for guiding social science research, but also somewhat insufficient for understanding and navigating the ethical landscapes in which we participate. So over here, we have a picture of the 2014 Montana General Election Voter Information Guide, and I don't know if this made as much of a splash in the Canadian Academy as it did in the United States, but this was an IRB-approved mailer that went out to registered voters in Montana as part of an experiment to test the effects of partisan labeling on nonpartisan judicial races. So we see, for example, the two candidates in the candidates in two different races, nonpartisan judicial races in Montana, ranked compared to the presidential candidates of that election cycle, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, sort of placing them on an ideological spectrum and looking at how this affected both turnout and the perception by voters of these candidates. So this is an example of an experiment, a social science experiment that was run with the approval of two different universities at ethics review boards, both on the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. And yet we can start to see how, in fact, this kind of intervention fails to accommodate an ethical approach to research involving interaction and human subjects in the social science realm. So this is why we see, for example, researchers and thinkers like Tracy, who have called for what she calls situational and relational ethics, the idea that we have to move beyond these medically based principles to think about the interpersonal dynamics of ethics in practice, or what Gilliman and Gillum have called ethical reflexivity, the constant iterative process of returning to ethical standards throughout the course of thinking through research projects. So this is where we come to the idea that I'm sort of hopefully contributing to this discussion, that in fact, who you are shapes what you find. And we know this from empirical studies of positionality and how it affects social scientific research. So positionality, who the researcher is, affects data collection in both large N and small n research settings. So if we look, for example, at Claridita et al.'s 2016 article on survey responses, particularly looking at the Afrobarometer, they looked at the difference conditioned by things like social desirability, interpersonal shared identity characteristics, and how who an enumerator was affected how survey respondents would respond to a survey. So they did multiple rounds of a survey with different identities of enumerators. So men and women, people from different ethnic groups, people who shared language, religion, or ethnicity, and those who did not, and how, in fact, when people were greeted by an enumerator with whom they felt they had some commonality, they expressed different opinions than those that were greeted by an enumerator from whom they thought of themselves as fundamentally different. This is obviously also true in small n research. We can look to scholars like Leanne Fuji or Lauren McLean, who have talked about the idea that in interpersonal interactions, we see that researchers who are doing things like interviews or participant observation collect different data and are given different responses in these interpersonal sort of interactions. So what we tend to think of in this positionality discourse is thinking about researchers as either insiders or outsiders. Right? So people like Claridita and her research colleagues talk about whether the enumerator and the respondent are part of the same group. Leanne Fuji will talk about whether or not researchers and their interlocutors are part of the same group. So fundamentally thinking about positionality as dual. You are either an insider in and of the community in which you are conducting research, or you are an outsider, someone who is coming from outside to understand this community. And so all of this gets back to the idea that research is fundamentally about interactions, right? We have contact between researchers and interlocutors that creates data, whether this is survey data, large N data, or whether this is small n interview transcripts or participant observation. And I want to make the argument that because research is interaction, because contact-based research involves people talking to people, that contact is based not only on who you are, but who you are assumed to be. So who you are, who your interlocutors are, and who your interlocutors assume you to be are critical in understanding the ethics of research in practice. And this is where I might sort of jump far enough to lose some people in terms of my argument, but I want to make the argument, in fact, that neutrality is an impossibility in contact-based research. And as such, there are no neutral research ethics. research ethics and the ethical landscape in which you participate is always conditioned by identities, both your quote unquote real identities, the things that you believe yourself to be, and those things that are assigned to you by your interlocutors. Because when interactions create data, those interactions are inherently imbued with questions about how researchers present themselves and how they are perceived by their interlocutors. So whereas we tend to think about positionality in terms of this duality of insiders and outsiders, what I want to argue, in fact, is that there's a lot of gray area between those two categories, because how your identities are revealed, perceived, or assumed by your interlocutors shapes the ethical landscape in which you participate when you're conducting your research. So this gets to the question, who are you, right? And this is a question, in fact, that I was asked a lot during the course of the research that became later my book. Because we know as researchers, partially because of the ethical administration in which we participate, that we curate our self-presentation. You have things like business cards, you have consent sheets, and in these formal interactions, those documents structure your interactions. Before you record, you have to get a consent sheet, whether it is signed, whether it is verbal. There is a very mechanistic process through which you supposedly certify yourself as an ethical researcher. But those pieces of information, that contact information on your consent sheet, that contact information on, say, your business or calling card, your university affiliations, your title, are not the only information that is available to your interlocutors when you are conducting your research. So if we think about it, if we think about the kinds of information that are available to interlocutors that might not show up on consent sheets, things like my racial identity, my gender identity, whether they are as I believe them to be, as I feel them to be, as I act them to be, or whether they are assumed upon me by interlocutors, that is information that goes into structuring the interactions that I had in the course of conducting my research. So I want to ask about what the ethical dilemmas are that are posed by being able to quote unquote pass as part of the population in which a researcher is participating versus those that structure interactions in which the researcher is obviously an outgroup member. So how does being able to move through a research space with the potential for blending in ethically differ from being labeled by observable characteristics as an outsider? So what does moving through the world undetected do to the ethical landscape in which a researcher participates? What access is available because of observable similarities? And how does that shape the interactions in which the researcher participates? So in sort of combing through the literature on research ethics and political science, I was perhaps unsurprisingly somewhat disappointed by the lack of engagement that we have with the idea of ethics within the interaction space. So rather than ethics as a regime in which you participate and then you conduct your research, the sort of ongoing process of conducting ethical research is something that I don't think political science as a discipline discusses enough. But I did sort of broadly speaking come across these two different strategies. One from Blee in 2006. She was an author who was conducting, I'm blanking on the name of her book right now, of course, but conducting research among white nationalist, white supremacist hate groups, and particularly women that participate in those groups in the early 2000s. And she stakes out her ethical position quite clearly at the beginning. She says that she is allowed access by virtue of the fact that she is a white woman into these white women's spaces, but that she immediately confronted any notion of political or ideological solidarity with these women. And the quote from page 11 says, "I made it clear that I did not share the racial convictions of these groups. I explicitly said that my views were quite opposed to theirs and that they should not hope to convert me to their views." There was an immediate confrontation. And later in the book, Blee sort of refers back to this idea of the confrontation and the ways in which it was both durable and not in terms of her interactions, the ways in which that initial confrontation, "you should not hope to convert me," became both less real and less convincing to the women with whom she was conducting her interactions. But she says that she continually reasserted this confrontation in the course of conducting her research, unless it got in the way of furthering sort of trust between her and her research subjects. And so we'll come back to that idea in just a second. The second is actually from an anthropologist, Sen in 2007, who conducted her research again among women's groups, this time in Western India, and particularly the Shiv Sena organization. And she says, the quote is a bit longer than what I have here, but she says, "The women introduced me to a world they thought was theirs, over which they thought they had a right to rule. But they only caught glimpses of my world. They thought they knew everything about me anyway. I watched these Sena women corporators attack and strip 2 Muslim women corporators in the Houses of Parliament. And then, having eaten ice cream with the women on the beach, I went home and helped during dinner, played with Kamala's grandson, told her son how to manage his dishonest accounts, and at the end of the day, I curled up in bed to write my notes. Now I loved them, now I hated them. Now I was an insider, now an outsider, but always an observer. I suffered several paradoxes and grave ethical dilemmas, which continue to haunt my writing. I felt my work came at a price, that of betraying the victims of violence with whom it is far easier to sympathize." So here we have sort of 2 potential questions of these women who are conducting this research within groups in which they can pass. How is it that they navigated the ethically difficult or complex landscapes in which they're participating? So on the one hand, we have this confrontation from Blee. On the other, we have this idea of haunting from Sen. And so this is where I want to start to talk about, in fact, my own research. So I conducted 14 months of in-depth field research in 2 different field sites. This involved things like participant observation, interviews, field notes, textual analysis, a little bit of archival work that didn't end up sort of making it into the book. So I don't really tend to talk about it because that's what you do about research that doesn't really work out, right? You just black hole it. But essentially I had these 2 different field sites. One in Bloemfontein among mostly white Afrikaans speakers, in which I largely blended in. If I didn't open my mouth, if I didn't betray the sort of grammatical slip-ups that one has when one has a cursory, an introductory conversational grasp of a language, I basically didn't attract attention. On the other hand, in Durban, I was conducting interviews and living in a mostly Black African community, interviewing people whose primary home language was Zulu. And this was a place in which, on everything from public transportation to in the grocery store to sitting in a church service, I was immediately recognizable as an outsider. Now, a bit of history. I had previously lived in Durban for university. I had a conversational grasp of Zulu that far exceeded my competence in Afrikaans. I'd studied it for 6 years. I was able to basically operate autonomously without things like a dictionary or Google Translate, right? That modern crutch that we all have. By contrast, I had never been to Bloemfontein before my plane touched down there for the first time when I planned to live there for 7 months. And I had only studied the language for 18 months. So my grammatical mistakes were many and varied, and my ability to sort of move through the world in the language was significantly less. So I didn't know the terrain, I didn't know the language, I didn't know the sort of place in which I was going to be living. And as I said, this is all to conduct things like interviews, participant observation, field notes, and newspaper analysis. So the question becomes, how does passing give privileges to a researcher, and how does that then potentially shape the ethical landscape in which that researcher is participating? So as I said, I could move through public space in Bloemfontein relatively unobserved. I could do things like participate in church services. I could do things like go to the grocery store without being questioned as to why I was there or what I was doing. But beyond that, I want to talk about things like the expressions of solidarity that happened in the course of my interviews and the levels of access that I was granted on the basis of assumed racial similarities, and therefore the consequence of those assumed similarities was a political and social solidarity with some of the things that were occurring in the interview space. And so I occupied in Bloemfontein this space that sort of existed between insiders and outsiders. So I'm calling these my sort of ethical confrontations. And it turned out that while I was in Bloemfontein, I was regularly interviewing people that had deeply held prejudices. I would walk through the world and try and set up an interview, and someone would say to me, "Oh, jij is the Amerikaner wat lijkt soos 'n Afrikaner meisie. You are the American who looks like an Afrikaner girl. Oh, okay, you," right? And that gave me access in ways that simply were not available to me in my other research sites. So if I go through my interview transcripts, if I go through the notes that I have, phrases like, "oh, you know," or "you understand," or "it's nice to let my guard down," were happening with alarming frequency, maybe not alarming, but with notable frequency in the course of interviews. So even with the official trappings of ethical research, consent sheets and business cards and the sort of desk in between the recorder, the notebook, there was an assumed solidarity with me on the basis of an assumed racial shared identity. So for example, I was in an interview with a young man who decided to tell me at great length about his moral, political, and social objections to things like interracial marriage. He explained to me that in his church, it was an abomination, it was a sin against God, based on the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, in which God decided to split up the human race into different language, ethnic, racial groups. And he ended the story with, "oh, but you understand." And that interjection was assuming things about me that, whether or not they are true, was a kind of ethical confrontation. It is not a belief to which I subscribe. It is not something that I morally or politically or even spiritually agree with. And it becomes imperative to think through what the responsibility of the researcher is in the course of that interaction. So does an assertion like that, one that I find morally, politically, and socially reprehensible, does it require refutation in the moment? And what are the implications of both refuting and encouraging continued speech on this theme? Does it require the interjection of my own ideas, my own history, my own familial or biographical details? When it's assumed that I would be in accord with these racist sentiments, what was my responsibility? Was it to record, to confront, to be haunted? What was the role of the researcher, and how does that sort of change things? It also became important in the course of my research to deal with discomfort, both my own discomfort and the discomfort of my interlocutors. So, for example, when I was conducting an interview with a young woman in Durban, she was a Black African woman, she explained to me in not a tremendous amount of detail, when I asked her the question, "what has happened in your life that is substantially different now than it was in 1993, 1992, 1991, since the early 1990s, this period of apartheid, what was different about multiracial democracy?" And she said, "well, now anyone can go anywhere. Now I can work in this office. Now I can have a job. I can send my children to whatever school they want to go to. But," and then there was this long pause. She said, "sitting with white people is still uncomfortable." And then, almost to herself, she said, "like now." So the sort of mirror image of that story is the mirror image of my first story is the second story. How do you deal with the discomfort? How do you understand? How do you process that, both as a person that is conducting research, as a person who is deeply invested in the social scientific project, but also as a human being operating ethically in the world? And what is the data that anyone can extract from that particular interaction? Is the discomfort data? Is the discomfort I had with the young man data? Is, oh, you know, data? And if it is, what sort of data is it? How can it be interpreted? How can it be understood? And what are the responsibilities for ethical conduct in these particular situations? Because saying things like, oh, yes, please go on, imply a kind of accord. And what I want to push us to think about is not necessarily a hard and fast line about planning these things in advance, but rather an idea that we need to consider what the ethical conduct of a researcher may or could or should look like in these confrontations and the range of possibilities that are available to researchers that face these kinds of things. So what are the implications? Well, I want to leave you with 4 central arguments. One, that we fundamentally need to discuss ethics beyond these institutional ethical sort of standards of the IRB or the REB, and beyond things like fieldwork practicalities, because the ethical landscape in which this contact-based research occurs is fundamentally conditioned by the scope, is fundamentally beyond the scope of institutional review. And secondly, it's conditioned by who these researchers are. So the second argument is that there has to be a critical examination of positionality in ethics training, and ethical guidelines, everything from deontology to virtue ethics to consequentialism, can be applied both to the idea of research, conducting research, and being a person who conducts research, or to the conduct of the researcher in those moments of ethical confrontation. But unless we discuss these things, unless we start to develop a language, this is point number 3, a language around the idea of ethics beyond the IRB, ethics of interpersonal conduct, the ethics of these interactions, then we end up applying things ad hoc. And so in that moment with that young man, in that moment with that young woman, I did not confront. I did not do what Blee did. What I did was what Sen did, without necessarily the toolkit to think through what the implications of that would be for me as a person moving through the world, for me as a researcher, or for me as a sort of person operating in the research space. So I want to argue that we need to develop new language and new concepts around the idea of ethics in practice and ethics in interaction. And then lastly, number 4, this is not an argument that everything needs to be planned in advance. And in fact, it's entirely the opposite, that we essentially need to equip researchers with the tools to think through what ethical decision-making looks like for researchers and researchers as people within the interview space. So that is what I have to talk about. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to start digging into some of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me start. Kelsey, Amanda, do you have any questions, comments, areas that you want to discuss? If not, I've got lots. As I was listening to you, I've been reading more. Okay, cool. I've been reading more of what are called writing with narratives, where researchers are sort of in conversation. And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of positionality and within the helping professions, there's a strong ethic around, therapists have their own therapists, and this recognition that processing becomes really essential to the work. And as someone who's about trying to push forward innovative research, I think a lot about what it is to sort of have that depth of trust and conversation with people from different perspectives, and particularly with this sort of insider-outsider piece. And when I've been sort of deeply embedded in research environments, how much it meant to be able to have someone there who I knew and I trusted, who could be a little bit of my translator and my feedback mechanism, but also how complex that is.
Yep.
And so, yeah, just kind of some reflections on this sort of processing and thinking with and co-interpretation, particularly in contexts where you might be more the outsider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I think we do a disservice sometimes in training graduate students to think that all writing while conducting research is for the purposes of research, because most of my field notes never made it into anything like a publication. They became a kind of autoethnographic, although I didn't really have the language for that, reflection on what it meant to move through this space, what it meant to sort of exist in these places, in addition to things like participant observation field notes of, being in a place as an observer. And I think that there is a real therapeutic idea of writing, and ultimately, right, the thing about contact-based research, especially when you have extended research timelines, so things like 14 months of living in a place and conducting research, there are structured research-based interactions, things like interviews where you have consent sheets and that sort of thing. And then there's life, right, which is actually the majority of your time in a research field site. And so I struggled a lot with how to delineate and shape the idea of what was data. So one of the confrontations I had, again, in this sort of passing category, I'd had a long day. I'd had failures and frustrations and all of this sort of thing. And I went to a pharmacy, and all I wanted to do was buy essentially headache tablets, paracetamol, right? I just needed some headache tablets, and I needed to go home and sleep. And I was trying my best to get through the interactions without reverting to English as part of my practice and all this sort of thing. And this gentleman behind me, an older gentleman, and I'm not a tall person. I don't know if you can tell that. I'm only about 5'4", but he was very tall, and he was very angry at me. He was angry at my grammatical mistakes. And he yelled at me. I mean, really stridently yelled at me about how I was one of those modern youths who had lost my heritage, and I should be ashamed of myself for not being able to speak in my mother tongue. Is that data? Right? There are no consent sheets. He was not aware of my sort of outsider presence. And yet that was input into my understanding of that place in that time. Right? And so this is where I think we need to really have a conversation about what it means to move through the world as a researcher in interactions with people, both those structured by what we think of as our sort of regimes of ethics, and those that are not, because those that are not are the invisible half of everything that we do. And it's, again, sort of getting back, interestingly, to the idea that we hide mess, right? We hide the messy part of research, and we say we do ethics. We do ethics because everything is cleared by the IRB or the REB. And I want to say that that's insufficient. I want to say that that conversation is insufficient, and that training, especially for new researchers, is insufficient.
Yeah. I so fundamentally agree, being in many of the same situations that you're describing, that there is nothing about institutional research ethics that really prepares you for what you're having to weigh in the moment and respond to.
Yeah.
Kelsey's asking, I'm wondering where you've spoken to this or people's assumptions about researchers impacting the interactions in your publications.
So this is a new research, or this is a new sort of reflection angle for me. So I did have an article that was published at the end of last year in PS, Political Science and Politics. And it's a relatively short piece on the idea of positionality and research ethics. But it's something that I really want to dive into more, because I think that a lot of times we dismiss these conversations as oh, it's just fluffy, or it's navel gazing, or it's just philosophy, right? What we do is social science. And yet we have these colleagues, right? These ethical philosophers that are sort of giving us some of the language and tools that we could potentially use to think through what ethical research looks like in practice. And so that's sort of my it's one of the things that I'm working on right now.
one of the I was doing a short course for people around trauma informed interviewing, and I had literally 10 pages of notes and considerations around context. And all of the things that you have to consider about where you're meeting and how it's set up and who has what control and all of that. And and then I was talking about things that sort of come directly from social work practice, the idea that like you can't leave until people are in a stable place if you have been going through a conversation with them that's bringing things up. And so, practical things like maybe you think that your protocol is going to take an hour, but it can take 3 hours if that's where people are at and you're working with really vulnerable people. And one of the things that, because a lot of my work is applied research and I'm looking at the impact of interventions, I'm always realizing how intensive the research is as an intervention in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that when thinking through trauma-informed interviewing, the press for narrative can sometimes be a real burden on the people with whom you're speaking, right? Make your pain into a story is a big ask. And so we have these rhetorical theorists, people like Elaine Scarry, who talk about the body in pain, or there's this book on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the press for narrativity in that space, right? Make your pain into a story. Tell us how your husband was killed. Tell us how your child went missing. And the fact that those stories, those interlocutors that were resistant to narrative were those that were not taken seriously in those spaces. And yet the pain that they're feeling is in no way less. They are still the people who have been victimized in the case of the TRC by the apartheid state. But because we can't make sense of their pain in narrative form, that it becomes less real. And so I think that, again, thinking through this stuff, this is not stuff we talk about when we're talking about interviewing. We talk about consent sheets and informed consent and harm to people. But do you talk about how beneficence should also include a respect for the idea that pain is a non-narrative experience? Grief is a non-narrative experience. There's no arc to it, right? We can talk about stages, we can talk about reconciliation, we can talk about all these things, but fundamentally the experience of these things is non-narrative, even if they have a sort of progression. And so I just want us to talk more about ethics because I think that we don't, and it leads us to making a lot of decisions that are not well informed or well grounded or well thought out. They are things that happen in the moment. And so I think a lot about what the confrontations I did not have with my interlocutors, the times at which I did not say, I have a multiracial family and I don't think it's an abomination. And even, 8 years after that interview, that's something that bothers me. Did I have the tools going into that research to think through this? I don't think I did. And I think that that's a problem. And I think we're doing a disservice both to our interlocutors, to our new researchers, to senior faculty, although I'm still junior at my institution, right? That we don't have these conversations before we send people off to have interpersonal interactions to create data that then becomes sort of quote unquote social science.
So it's interesting because one of the things that I think I come very much sort of from the Sen style. Like I don't. I was actually really shocked at the first researcher, the idea of sort of saying upfront, I don't agree with anything you say. Now talk to me for an hour or two. I was just like, wow, okay. I didn't even know you could do that. And
right.
So I am really intrigued by, if you did have any of those experiences of sort of being really upfront about your views and then how that changed the nature of what was coming out.
And I did not have those kind of confrontations. And I don't think that the haunting angle the idea that you don't have those confrontations, you just let the people talk, let their voices be heard. I think that is a completely ethically defensible position, right? If we think about utilitarian ethics, the idea that you are achieving a goal with your interaction, that goal being understanding the social environment in which you're participating, then haunting is a very real ethical choice that is very much in line with the idea of conducting research that is ethical and not harming people. Right. But in that case, you have to think about the sort of harms to potentially researchers, the burdens that you carry, the fact that I still think about this. I don't think I did something unethical in that interaction. I think that that data was available to me because of who my interlocutor assumed me to be. That researcher, that another researcher, a differently positioned researcher, might not have sort of elicited that same response. And that is now information that is in my book, and so therefore in the public sphere, and people can reflect on it. And there is an ethical utility to bringing out socially undesirable responses, because those are there, even if they won't say them to other people. So I don't think that haunting is an unethical approach to research, but it is a choice. And it is a choice that we make, I think, without thinking through the benefits or drawbacks of it.
But that also strikes me as one of the opportunities of the education piece, is for people to be able to think through in advance and to potentially be able to shift some of their understanding going in such that haunting is not the result.
Yes, exactly.
We're able to
exactly.
Because I'm thinking about all of these sort of interactions in my experience, and exactly those kinds of things where people are talking about extremely racist things that I have a really hard time with, and none of that has haunted me, and I'm thinking, why hasn't it haunted me? What was that about? And I think that part of it was that because my work has always been applied research, and it's been about sort of resolving systems that are fundamentally racist, it was exactly that. It was, if you can't speak the dark side, if people don't feel safe speaking the dark side, we can't actually get to any of what's going to fix things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I kind of got to a place where, like, I was doing a lot of self-work at the time, and I was doing a lot of work with a colleague who was racialized, and so had, been in this situation many, many times that I had it, where she was hearing things that were offensive, and needing to be able to act professionally within that context. It was essentially kind of like coaching me through being able to do that. But I feel like some of it is about that decision at the front end, and then being able to review it over time. But also just the framing of it, that in terms of that utility, that there is fundamental value in being able to hear what people believe, whether or not you agree with it. And that in some ways, you as the researcher, even though you are absolutely part of the experience, and you're not just a you're not just a neutral figure in this, you do kind of have to get out of the way a little.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is where the sort of 4 schools of ethics, right? The virtue ethics and deontology and consequentialism or utilitarianism, and rights-based ethics, right? So I would say that Blee is really like following ethical rules. She is saying, I am not a person who believes in what you believe in, right? And she's stating that up front. Sen is more of a utilitarian, right? She is more saying it is valuable to understand Indian politics in this moment and in this community, to understand that these are people who hold deeply hateful views, right? That are deeply prejudiced. But the fact that those are being brought out is a virtue, right? That there is utility in uncovering deeply held prejudice. And that only comes, especially for someone who marks themselves as an outsider, with trust, with, again, as you said, sort of speaking to the dark side, right? Being able to say something, being able to speak the language, saying, yes, please go on, tell me more. and opening up that space to let those things be heard. But again, I want to come back to the idea, right? That's a decision.
Right.
It's a decision that I don't think should be made in the moment of confrontation. It should be a strategy that should be applied consistently, that should be understood to have costs and benefits for the researcher and their interlocutors and their final product. And I don't think that we think through those decisions until we're confronted. I certainly didn't, at least.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm realizing we're at time, but part of our work within Spark is we are thinking about how a lot of the sort of boundary areas of social research is pushing beyond things that research ethics boards comment on, and how to sort of better inform the depth of ethical considerations. And I think what you're sort of offering is a challenge for us to be able to really engage people in sort of pre-ethics review consideration when they're doing contact-based research about how they're going to think about and weigh all of this. And then, of course, all of the pieces that we put in, like, are you meeting people in their homes? And what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, and that there needs to be an ongoing consideration, right? This is not just a series of upfront decisions. It's a toolkit to start your research, and then it's an iterated conversation about what ethics looks like in practice, not as a series of checkboxes that you do at the beginning and then never think about again. Right? What's the number of times you read your review board filing after it was approved? For me, it's zero, right? Zero. I had zero contact with that document after it was approved. And yet you're still making all these ethical decisions in the context of these interactions, in the context of your field sites, in the context of your contact, that I think are not part of our discussion of what research ethics looks like.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. At least it was fun for me.
No, it was so great. And you know, I always consider it a very good conversation when I come out with work to do. Kelsey, Amanda, any last comments, questions? All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Be well.